As a society, we really need to stop romanticizing ancient sexuality. Well, why? If you look at ancient Sumer, then honestly, one thing stands out immediately, and that is structured feminine authority. Sumer, emerging in southern Mesopotamia around the 4th millennium BCE, is one of the earliest known urban civilizations in history. This civilization produced writing, law codes, administrative systems, temple economies, and even recorded literature. Now, within this ancient civilization, the foundation here was not only male kingship at all, but institutionalized female spiritual authority. Women here were worshipped. They were seen as symbols of power and of authority. So let's just say that life was completely different back then in ancient Sumeria. The priestess class tied to the goddess Inanna, while they were central to Sumerian civilization and also to Sumerian religious beliefs and their practices. So, who was goddess Inanna? Inanna was not a soft fertility female figure at all. She was power, war, erotic force, political legitimacy, descent, and also return. Inanna embodied attraction and also domination at the same time, and she was revered and worshipped by everybody. She embodied what our modern civilization, which now is unfortunately predominantly masculine in nature, tried to erase from our history and also from our collective memory. The goddess Inanna was probably one of the most complex deities within the ancient world, and she is so often completely misunderstood. She governed sexuality. Yes, she governed sexuality, but also warfare, kingship, political authority, and most importantly, cosmic order. So rulers derived legitimacy through her favor alone. Temples dedicated to her were economic and political hubs, and these were respected and revered by the entire Sumerian civilization and society. Now, this was absolutely deliberate because these ancient people deeply understood the power embedded within the feminine body. They understood the female power, that the universe is predominantly feminine in nature. Inanna's descent myth is not about suffering, but about voluntary confrontation with the underworld, with the shadow, with things that are scary that people try to avoid. She strips, descends, is dismantled, and then re-emerges, reinstated, and even more powerful than before. Now, all of this is deep initiation language, and a lot of it is shrouded in mysticism. It encodes a very important forgotten principle, and that is that feminine power is not actually fragile at all. It is powerful. It is forged through controlled descent into intensity and chaos because the women births form out of raw chaos from the universe. So, this myth of Inanna is one of the oldest recorded literary narratives within human history. And this myth was also preserved and then transmitted through various temple cultures, including by women. Actually, mostly by women, because women were central figures here. And this is also where something very critical enters this narrative. One of the earliest named authors in our recorded history is Enheduanna. She was a high priestess of Goddess Inanna within the 21st century BCE. Now, she composed hymns and also devotional poetry to Goddess Inanna. And surprise, surprise, these are among the very first known written works attributed to a specific individual. And that individual was a woman. Not a man, but a woman. And this matters really deeply if we want to look at how civilization evolved, or rather de evolved, since that period of time when the feminine was worshipped, revered, and understood as being powerful. The first recorded voice in literary history is not a king boasting, but a priestess writing hymns to a goddess of power and also erotic sovereignty. Not to a god, but to a goddess. The goddess. Now, music and poetry in Sumer were not about entertainment at all. These were ritual technologies, carefully crafted, thought through, and hymns to Inanna were performed within temple contexts. So, sacred sounds, sexuality, kingship, and also cosmic order, all of these things were interlinked and they worked together. Now, given the background, let's add something that most people always try to avoid, and that is sex as ritual. Within Sumer, sexuality was not a casual practice at all. It was institutionalized, ritualized, and sacred in most contexts, deeply revered and understood. The hieros gamos, which means sacred marriage, was not about romance at all. This was a ceremonial, ritualized practice, and the purpose was to align king and priestess with one another. Well, why do you ask? Remember the age-old Hermetic axiom here: as above, so below, and as within, so without. So, what does that mean? Well, earthly governance mirrored the cosmic order: as below, as above. And erotic union symbolized fertility of land, stability of rule, and also alignment within divine structure. So the Hieros Gamos was enacted in temple settings alone as part of New Year rites in certain city-states of ancient Sumeria. And absolutely nothing about this was random, nor casual, nor recreational sex. It wasn't just sex at all. This was deeply symbolic and also political theology that was embodied through the priestess who represented Goddess Inanna, and then either the king or the high priest who represented her divine consort. Now, their union within this sacred marriage signified the renewal of sovereignty, and it kept the city at peace, and it was also the glue that kept the entire community together. So people respected this. And women actually dedicated their entire lives to what they called temple service. And that meant discipline, training, ritual knowledge. literacy in some cases, and in certain roles, participation in sacred rites that included structured sexual rites. Now, this erotic act that is often misunderstood within this framework was not about having pleasure at all. This was an enactment of cosmic order and deeply important to the ancient civilization. And this matters today in this video and in our modern society. Because sex was not private indulgence, it was actually metaphysical architecture in ancient Sumeria. But there's much more to ancient Sumeria than only temple prostitution and sacred sex as ritual. So let's talk about the Anunnaki. Who were they? Why are they important? Why are they important today in our modern civilization? The Anunnaki represented the ruling cosmic hierarchy within ancient times, specifically within ancient Sumeria. So, in symbolic terms, they encoded this whole idea that order descended from above and must be maintained below at all times through ritual, through structure, through discipline. So, if we look at myths, in many myths, they are the council of gods who determine fate and legitimacy of rulers. They weren't random at all. They also weren't a myth. The priestesses mediated between that order and human society. So when the priestess enacted sacred union, it was all about alignment and keeping and maintaining this cosmic order. So we can say that sacred union represented legitimacy, order, structure, and stability. See, when sexuality becomes ritualized, then it stops being a chaotic thing and it stops leaking your life force. Instead, it becomes stabilizing. And that, well, that is the difference between mere indulgence in sex and sex as power. Now, this whole idea shifted forward geographically into ancient Egypt because sacred sex was just as important within the ancient Egyptian world. So, trade, migration, and shared symbolic motifs. All of these moved between Mesopotamia and the Nile. So Egypt absorbs and then transforms earlier Mesopotamian currents. The sacred marriage dynamic continues in different forms within the Egyptian culture, but it's still continued here. Now, the whole polarity between the divine feminine and then obviously the divine masculine becomes encoded within the Egyptian myth through figures such as the goddess Isis and the god Osiris. So, again, if we look closely at their myth, union equals restoration of power and of order. The goddess Isis does not passively mourn Osiris at all. She takes action. She reconstitutes him. She restores his potency and she generates continuity. So, if we look at this, it's very clear that the ancient Egyptians also understood feminine power as regenerative intelligence, as metaphysical order, as divine and sacred. In Egyptian theology, the restoration of Osiris through the goddess Isis is directly tied to kingship and also to the continuity of rule and rulers in ancient Egypt. We can clearly see that the same core idea from ancient Sumeria persists here, and that is that erotic and regenerative force stabilizes sovereignty, personally and as a society. And the pattern holds because erotic force linked to sovereignty, restoration, and legitimacy was practiced all throughout Egypt, deeply understood, revered, and respected. Now, let's have a look at what the Bhagavad Gita actually says in a different setting entirely, because people often don't understand this. Krishna does not say no to sex, nor to pleasure at all. He actually teaches discipline, disciplined sex, disciplined sacred union. And karma yoga means to act fully, but without attachment. Don't be attached to that outcome. This principle is identical to what structured sacred sexuality actually requires. That means you engage fully. You don't collapse into cravings. You release that outcome. You manifest it through sex, through sacred sex, through ritual. Now, in Sumer, erotic ritual without discipline destabilized the hierarchy. And in Egypt, misuse of sacred sex destabilized Ma'at, which means order. And in the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, sex without discipline destabilized the self, the individual. This is the same law, just different societies. We can even move forward into the tantric texts themselves. Check out my other videos on this topic on my channel. Now, Tantra does not just randomly invent sacred sex out of nowhere because they wanted to indulge. It systemizes something older. Sexual energy is power, and that power has to be directed. In Shakta traditions, Shakti is the active force. Now, Shiva without Shakti is inert because energy animates structure. Now, all of this is the same formula already visible in Sumer. The priestess is the active energy, the king is the structure. Isis is the regenerative force, and Osiris the form. Shakti is the energy, and Shiva is the consciousness. And if we look at the Gita, well, Arjuna is the action, and Krishna the awareness. All of this is simply different mythic languages, but identical architecture. So, with all of that being said, let's backtrack to the hieros gamos, the sacred marriage, which was not about romance at all. I said before, this was about fusion, fusion of polarity, but under supervision and with intention, meaning directed under will. As Alistair Crowley would say, love under will. Now, this was political theology, and this political theology was enacted through the body, the physical body, or rather, two bodies. This signaled that power was not merely inherited, no, it had to be ritually confirmed. So, sex? Sex became a sacred oath. And when women dedicated their lives to temple roles, they were not submitting, they were entering a structure where their erotic capacity was treated as a force of nature, not as shame. It was respected, it was honored, and that force required discipline, it required practice, it required stability and also containment. Now, that is what I call sovereignty. Feminine sovereignty is not loud and reactive. It is the ability to hold intensity and not fragment in the process. The goddess Inanna descends into the underworld and returns intact. The goddess Isis restores and reconstitutes. Tantric Shakti rises, but still she is directed. And Krishna instructs Arjuna to act but without attachment. So we can see a common denominator here. And this is that intensity does not equal loss of control at all. So let's bring all of this into our modern society. If you orgasm and orgasm is chaotic, then it reinforces craving and lust. But if it is structured, intentional, and followed by release of attachment, then it conditions your life force. Now that is karma yoga applied to sexual energy. What does it mean? You act. You are not passive. Then you peak. You release all expectation. And then afterwards, after all of this, you stabilize. Now, this post-ritual silence in ancient systems mirrors meditation. It's almost identical. Sex is like a circuit, and integration completes the circuit. Without it, the intensity becomes an addiction. It scatters your life force, it leaks your prana. Now, let's bring the Anunnaki back, but in psychological terms. They represent order above instinct. When instinct dominates without structure, then all hierarchy collapses. When instinct is integrated, though, then order stabilizes. Now, all of that applies internally. When your sexual impulse dominates your awareness, then that intensity fragments. When awareness, though, directs your impulse, your identity consolidates. Now, that is the real power behind ritualized sex. Now, if we layer Tantra on top of all of these systems, then we can see that it is not undisciplined at all. It is discipline. It includes breath control, mantra, energy circulation, containment of ejaculation, and also deliberate post ritual stillness after sex. So the act itself becomes the mechanism, and this is not casual pleasure at all. It is applied psychology through your body. Now, Sumer encoded this politically, and Egypt then encoded it cosmologically, and the Bhagavad Gita, well, they encoded it ethically. Tantra encoded it technically. So we have four different expressions of one single law, and that is that sexual energy has to be directed. Now, modern culture separates sexuality from discipline. Ancient systems did the exact opposite. They merged it with responsibility. And that was the real, raw, true power. That is why female sovereignty sat at the center of this. A sovereign woman does not suppress her desire. She also does not weaponize it unconsciously. She doesn't seek validation. She directs it. She understands it. She embraces it. And she steps into her power. Now, you as a man can do the exact same thing. Our mindset as a modern society just needs to change. It needs to adjust. We shouldn't de-evolve. We should evolve. We should look back to the ancient systems that worked. We should apply them, adjust them, and bring them back into our modern lives. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you like this content, please like, comment, and subscribe. You can also follow me on Patreon. My link is below. See you guys next time.